very welcome to this morning's event, which is hosted by the Housing Europe Research Observatory. This is part of a series we've been trying to do in recent times, which is aligned with the presidency of the Council of the European Union. So as you know, Ireland is the esteemed member state who currently holds the honour of being president of the Council of the European Union, and we thought we would ask them about their views about housing, how that relates to EU policy and what we can expect from them in the coming 6-month period. But also it's the opportunity to check in on the domestic situation in Ireland to understand and to help colleagues from other member states or for the EU institutions to understand a little bit about the housing context in Ireland and maybe how that could colour or shape some of the priorities that we see from them in the coming 6 months. So as I said, the event is hosted by the Housing Europe Research Observatory. Just to give you a little bit of background, that is myself, Darragh Turnbull, the research coordinator, along with my colleague Alicia Pettini, the research director. We are very proud to have worked very closely with our colleagues in Ireland in recent years. And here you see actually just a small selection of some of the research that we have produced that's been funded or co-funded by Irish agencies, including Housing 2030, which was a collaboration between ourselves and the United Nations, which was co-funded by the Housing Agency. A recent study on cost-based social rental housing in Europe, which is funded by the Housing Agency. Another report on approved housing body structures in Europe, also funded by the Housing Agency. And then very recently, maybe some of you would have seen already, a very comprehensive piece of work, about 400 pages of analysis, a lot of time and effort, social and public housing in the EU and UK, which was funded by the Department of Housing. Also, it's important to mention, and this is kind of the framing of today's event, every 2 years in the Research Observatory, we produce our kind of signature publication, The State of Housing in Europe, in which we have a synthesis, analysis of the overarching themes for the previous 2 years, the challenges from the affordable housing sector, but also we have the opportunity to take a look at each member state. So here you see some of the key findings from the most recent analysis from Ireland, which is 2025, and the next edition will be due next year around the middle of the year 2027. So without further ado, to quickly introduce the speakers we have today, 3 speakers: Donald McManus from the Irish Council for Social Housing, Diarmuid O'Leary from the Irish Department of Housing, and Rosalind Molloy from the Irish Housing Agency. Donald will be our first speaker. He has a bit of a constraint. He will be running off as soon as he's finished his intervention to speak actually with colleagues at the Irish Department for Housing. So Donald, basically what I've asked from you this morning is, imagine that you are in a room with the key officials from the European Union, Commissioner Dan Jorgensen, for example, and you had 10 minutes to ask them for something. What would you ask the Commissioner? What would you ask his colleagues? How can Brussels help you and your colleagues in Ireland to do better and go further in terms of delivering social and affordable housing? Donald, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Darragh, and thanks to Housing Europe for the invitation to contribute here, and thanks to all those speakers to allow me go ahead with this. Look, in terms of the EU and the Commission, obviously in Ireland, for instance, we've got a history of having support at EU level, whether it's through from procurement, SGI, EIB funding and so forth. So there has been involvement in Europe, and Europe isn't a single entity. It's different elements of Europe, and sometimes people think Europe is this singular homogeneous body that can support directly or indirectly housing, which is the case. What I would say to start off with, and that's part of the issue, is there are many different parts of European institutions are doing things in housing directly or indirectly. And one thing I would ask them, the Commissioner, is we need probably a clearinghouse, because sometimes different parts of the Commission have different priorities. There's different focus on different areas, like, for instance, DG ECOFIN may be different from DG Social Inclusion and so forth, and employment. So the first thing would be that all parts of the EU institutions, in a sense, working together, having a common voice. We have an affordable housing plan now, and it's important there is a sort of coherency within all the institutions for that. So that'll be the first task. I would say on the next level, what Europe could do in terms of the MFF, the financial framework, the provision of housing isn't even checked in there, and that's whether it's through cohesion funds or renovate or whatever. I think that should be a bigger part of the complementary funding. Obviously, housing is not a compass at European level, but it complements some of the initiatives taken at member state level. And I think with the MFF provision and the new provision, more should be targeted towards social affordable housing, which links into the third area, is the whole issue of how social affordable housing is classified. And one example is this is a European issue, probably started as an Irish issue called classification, where in Ireland, about a decade ago, Irish housing associations, which I represent as ICCH in Ireland, were reclassified as part of the government debt. Now that happened first in Ireland. It then moved to Finland. Denmark has some issues with classification, and the Netherlands. So I think this can't be resolved within in Irish presidency time, but I do think being on the agenda now, this is a major issue which is creeping below the surface, will have a major impact for the finance and the pan-European investment platform in the years ahead. So looking again at the classification issue, looking at the accounts with Eurostat for 2010, which is a decade and a half ago, I think that's one thing the Commissioner could really put more focus on, because it does impact on delivery on finance, and also links into things like how debt is classified. Is housing going to be classified as debt or an investment purposes? And obviously in the social affordable housing sector, we would see that as investment for long term in perpetuity. So that will be a key operational aspect, because it has manifested itself and could also affect emerging new housing association sectors in places like Czechia and Hungary, who need certainty in terms of developing their sector. So I think this has become a bigger issue, not purely an Irish issue 10 years ago. Now it's swept across the Union, and I think that's one issue could be tackled head on, and it needs support from different parts of the EU for that. I think that the other area which both affects us in Ireland and other member states probably as well is trying to meet the commitments on the climate action. And at the moment, so many member states, the social climate plans haven't been adopted yet, which is important for us as operators to deliver. We need certainty. We have a pretty good framework in Ireland, improved conditions over the last year from our Energy Agency of Ireland. That's going to transition into the social climate plan and fund. And we think those plans need to be adopted fairly quickly, because any social affordable housing operator plan for the years ahead, and they need certainty. So we would call on the Commission to make sure those plans are adopted to allow the rollout of funding for retrofitting, which is going to be a key issue both for member states and for the EU in years ahead. So that's a particular ask both from Ireland and from other member states as well. And we're not quite sure how many of the social climate plans have been adopted yet, but it does feed into the funding is going to be required. I think just in terms of the wider ask is to continue all the good work has been done by EIB with in Ireland with social housing, Roslyn will talk about, and cost rental housing through the Housing Finance Agency. I think to continue with that, because that has provide a very good vehicle indirectly through the state agencies to provide finance, well-priced finance for social and affordable housing. So that could continue and increase. And other vehicles like Elena, which is a very useful technical tool in Ireland, we're looking at that at the moment, and to try and again support those Elena programs to allow people to scale up and replicate. And it's always scale up and replicate them in the new affordable housing plan. So that would be a particular ask. In terms of homelessness, obviously the Irish presidency is going to look at that in terms of the European Council and adoption of the recommendations. And I think that's a key part for homelessness itself, but also in terms of people delivering housing as well. There's certainty initiatives with that. I think those would be the main areas. I do think what we have experienced over the last 20, 30 years, and in fairness, Dara, and yourselves in Housing Europe, there has been kind of Europeanization of ideas in housing. Okay, there's not a direct competency, but exchange of views, whether it's in cost rental, whether it's in homelessness, has been very productive. And even in the past, Ireland took a lead role in the informal meeting of housing ministers, and that should be sort of bolstered again in the years ahead. We think that could help provide for platforms. So they're probably key asks. We think that EU could do more in terms of more coordination of their policies, the MFF, the classification issue, social climate plans, and continued investment with the IB and other programs as well, like for instance through cohesion funds and so forth. So that'll be a couple of areas we think, and as recipients of funding within our sector, we think that could complement what's going to happen at member state level, and it is important to ensure that there are vehicles to support new models, new emerging models of social housing in Europe, and that can be done through various innovation funds by the Commission, like revolving funds and cost recovery are the new dimension to provide long-term social and affordable housing through member states level. So I think that could be important added value that the European Commission could do, and things like revolving funds and so forth. So that's just a few thoughts where we've been from and we're going to in terms of what Europe could do to complement and really try and support those 4 pillars in the Affordable Housing Action Plan that Europe has set aside, because it is a big challenge. We have crises throughout the European Union. We're chipping away at different bits, but we have to coordinate much better to ensure all citizens of Europe are housed or satisfactorily. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Donal. And actually that leads very, very well the series of kind of asks for the Commissioner and for his colleagues. This leads very well into our next speaker. Donal, I know, as I mentioned at the beginning, you have to leave us now. Thank you for filling in at the last moment. Okay. I know there was a change on your side, so good luck with your meetings for the rest of the day. And it was good to speak to you. Thank you very much.
Right. So now,
thank you, Donal. Thank you. So now I'm going to pass over very quickly, because we're going to keep as much as possible to the hour that we've set for this meeting. So I'll pass over to Diarmuid O'Leary, who is Principal Officer, Head of Housing Coordination and EU Unit in the Housing Policy and Standards Division at the Irish Department of Housing. Diarmuid, you're very welcome this morning. Thank you very much. Just to say, we see your slides in the presenters mode. Let's give you a second. That's perfect.
So
now we see it.
Can you see that, Dara? Yes. Okay. And you can hear me okay? Yes.
Perfect. Go ahead.
It's always a relief to me when the IT works to a fashion. Anyway, good morning, everyone. And thank you, Dara, for your introduction. And thank you and Housing Europe for organising this webinar and for inviting the department to participate. As Dara mentioned, my unit is responsible for general housing coordination within the Irish Department or Ministry of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And my team are also leading on EU housing matters for the department. So my team is following closely the work of the EU Housing Task Force and then the implementation of the European Affordable Housing Plan. I should say, by the way, that our department has a very wide policy remit, and in an EU policy context, we are dealing with subjects as diverse as nature and biodiversity, water, civil protection, urban development and spatial planning, as well as housing. And as I said, my focus is on that housing piece. So that's a picture of the Custom House, which is HQ of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. And I'm sitting at the moment at the north side of that building, the other side, just to give you a position of where I am. But a bit of a general overview, I suppose, of the Irish presidency. First of all, the presidency has 3 main themes. Sorry if that's blocking there. Has 3 main themes: competitiveness, values, and security. And the presidency, they are interlocking and mutually reinforcing themes, and will guide all aspects of the work of our presidency. Our presidency will also be guided by the Irish proverb, Níneart go cur le céile, which translates as there is no strength without togetherness or unity. And I think that strength and unity motto is a good one to follow. Okay, frozen. There we are. Highlights of the presidency: we'll host 22 informal ministerial meetings, including one for housing ministers. There'll be an informal meeting of EU heads of state and government, a European Community Summit with 47 European leaders, and approximately 250 conferences and stakeholders events associated with the presidency. I don't want to steal Rosalind's thunder or give her presentation, but I do want to give a little bit of the housing policy context at a national level in Ireland, because I think it's important. The government published its new National Housing Action Plan, Delivering Homes, Building Communities 25 to 30, in November last year. That was about a month or so before the European Affordable Housing Plan. And the plan is, it's a whole of government plan. It's an integrated housing and homelessness plan as well, which I think is relevant in this context. It's guided by 10 core principles. And I just put that slide up there because I think they give an important kind of political context for the plan. I'm not going to go through them all, but just to mention a few. The first principle states that housing is the government's #1 priority. So housing is the Irish government's #1 priority. And I think it follows then that housing will have an important focus during our EU presidency. The principles affirm that homelessness is unacceptable, and that the solution is the supply of more homes, along with the supports to tackle root causes. There is a commitment to record levels of state investment in social and affordable housing, as well as the critical infrastructure necessary to unlock housing at scale. And I suppose that infrastructure element is probably the part of the new plan that differentiates from predecessors. And these principles acknowledge that the government must work with all delivery partners and stakeholders to realise the objectives of the plan. So I suppose that brings us back to that strength and unity approach that at national level this time that I mentioned earlier. So the plan targets the delivery of 300,000 new homes by 2030, which is a very significant scaling up of existing delivery. And within that target then, that includes 72,000 social homes and 90,000 affordable housing supports. The plan is built on 2 pillars. Activating supply is the first one, and that's about creating the environment for activating the supply of the 300,000 new homes needed. It's about zoning more land, providing critical infrastructure, addressing viability, securing private investment, and increasing the adoption of modern methods of construction and upskilling our workforce. The second pillar then is supporting people, which is about working towards ending homelessness, supporting affordability, and then addressing the housing needs of people as they progress through life. And those 2 pillars then make up our housing action plan, Delivering Homes, Building Communities. Turning to the European Affordable Housing Plan, we think certainly it aligns very well with Ireland's national plan. And although it has 4 pillars, the first 2, boosting supply and mobilising investment, fall with our activating supply pillar. And then the second are clearly part of the supporting people pillar of our national plan. I'll just mention too, in this context, the European Parliament's House Committee report from March, which also aligns well with the European Affordable Housing Plan and identifies many of the same challenges as solutions as our own national housing plan. So, turning to the housing elements of Ireland's EU presidency. During our presidency, we want to build on the tremendous work done by Denmark and Cyprus during their EU presidencies over the last 12 months in raising the profile of housing at EU level. Apologies for the noise in the background. We want to progress further the housing agenda through supporting the implementation of the European Affordable Housing Plan. And we want to deepen knowledge sharing, consensus building, and dialogue among member states on housing and homelessness policy issues, which perhaps could be improved. At a practical level, we want to progress 2 main legislative files. The first is the proposal for a Council recommendation on fighting housing exclusion, which was published with the EU anti-poverty strategy in May. And this recommendation is intended to support vulnerable persons in precarious housing situations and to prevent and address homelessness. And it promotes the design and implementation of policies based on a person-centred, housing-led and integrated policies approach, which certainly in Ireland we would support. And this initiative builds on the work of the European Platform on Combating Homelessness, or EPOC, as well as the commitment to work towards ending homelessness by 2030 from the Lisbon Declaration. So on this file, it's currently progressing quite intensively through the Social Affairs Working Party, with the objective of securing agreement ahead of adoption of the EPSCO Council in Luxembourg on the 19th of October. And so far, at least, that file seems to be progressing well within the Social Questions Working Party. The second file is a proposal for an Affordable Housing Act and Commission recommendation on housing affordability and supply in areas under housing stress. Now, this is, I suppose, a little bit of an unknown quantity at this stage. It's expected to be published in September, but we do understand that the Affordable Housing Act will aim to support public authorities in identifying areas of housing stress and to take measures to protect housing affordability in those areas, including with regard to short-term rentals. And our aim is to progress the file towards a general approach in through the Internal Market Working Party under the Competitiveness Council. And the last Competitiveness Council under our presidency will be the 3rd of December. I think it's probably ambitious to achieve a general approach by then, but we'll certainly work as intensively as we can between the middle of September and the end of November on this file and see how far it takes us. In terms of events, on the 25th and 26th of November, we will host an informal meeting of the EU ministers responsible for housing in Dublin. And this political level meeting will provide a high level platform for experience sharing and dialogue, including on key elements of the implementation of the European Affordable Housing Plan. For the first time, we intend to align the housing informal with a ministerial meeting of the European Platform on Combating Homelessness. And this is to take the opportunity to convene a joint session bringing together ministers responsible for both housing and homelessness. In Ireland, our minister is responsible for housing and homelessness, but that is not necessarily the case in other member states. So we want to take that opportunity to have a joint session. And it's not a fortunate coincidence, but a very conscious choice to align the two policy areas, because we believe that joining forces can create synergies and produce better results. I also just want to take the opportunity to mention some other important developments which will be ongoing during the term of the Irish presidency. The EU Housing Task Force is working on the Housing Simplification Package, which is a commitment in the European Affordable Housing Plan. That package is currently out for public consultation and it's generally an important priority for Ireland. The Construction Services Act may not be published during the Irish presidency, but that work is ongoing in the Commission. Off-site construction, or modern methods of construction, or innovation in construction, however you want to describe it, is a very important element of our own national housing plan, and we are currently exploring with the Commission how we might best promote the use of off-site construction during our presidency, and perhaps that would happen at the informal meeting in November. We will also support the Commission in progressing the Pan-European Investment Platform and the European Housing Alliance during our presidency. I'll mention finally the proposed Housing Summit. Just to note that Commission President von der Leyen referred in her remarks during her visit to Ireland in July, at the start of this month, of the intention to hold a housing summit during our presidency. And really all I can say or advise at this stage is that the location, date, and format of such a summit remain under discussion. So I can't give any more dates other details other than that. Finally, I just would encourage you to visit our presidency website, which is there for further information, and to thank you all for listening. And thanks again to Dara and to Housing Europe for hosting this event and for inviting us to participate. Thank you.
Gurb Malgut, Diarmid, for that very insightful presentation. Indeed, I know a number of people were trying to find those sort of key dates, those sort of key dossiers all in one place. So to have that presentation is really, really useful. So thank you very much. Just to mention at this point, there is opportunity for people to ask questions to our speakers. You can do so through the Q&A tab at the top of your screen. Although, obviously, for procedural reasons, Diarmid, for example, will not be able to comment on open dossiers. That's standard procedure. So if you have any questions about the MFF or any of the dossiers that Diarmid mentioned, unfortunately, he won't be able to comment on those. That's just standard protocol, unfortunately, in these things. But if you have any other questions, I'm sure himself or Rosalind, our next speaker, will be happy to pick those up. So indeed, moving along, our final speaker is Rosalind Malloy. She is the Head of Policy and Practice at the Housing Agency, which is effectively the national agency in Ireland, which is providing a lot of supports, research and knowledge, also running a lot of housing programmes and supports for vulnerable households, and working very closely with Diarmid and his colleagues in the department. So Rosalind, over to you.
Great. Okay, Dara, can you let me know, is that sharing with everybody?
That's perfect, yes.
Great. Okay, so good morning and thank you to Dara and to Housing Europe for the opportunity to speak today. And I've been asked to provide some of the context, describe, I suppose, the housing system in Ireland, our model, and talk about some of the challenges and some of the key policy initiatives that are underway. So before I go any further, I'd like to just describe the Housing Agency, which is where I work. We're a non-commercial state agency operating under the arm of the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage. Our vision is to deliver homes people need, and our role is to support the implementation of housing policy through specialist expertise, research, which you heard we support from Dara at the beginning of this session. We provide practical assistance to deliver on housing programmes. And I suppose national housing policy is led by the department and our colleagues, but the Housing Agency will then provide technical expertise, coordination and operational support across the system. And I suppose we have looked, we're quite unique in how we do this. There are a couple of other state agencies similar to us across Europe, but how we fit in the housing system, you'll see in this next slide. So here I've kind of just made up a slide showing the organisations with distinct but closely connected responsibilities for social and affordable housing. So all of the different organisations on this slide are helping deliver and support the delivery and management and regulation of social and affordable housing in Ireland. So as I said, the Department of Housing is the principal national body responsible for the policy, legislation, funding and oversight along with the government. And then we have three key under housing delivery partners. These are the 31 local authorities or municipal authorities that we have across the country. The Land Development Agency, which is the state's affordable housing delivery body, which was set up in 2018 with the role to maximise the supply of affordable homes on state land or acquired land, and the more than 400 approved housing bodies or associations providing homes to people. In terms of supporting organisations, as well as ourselves in the Housing Agency, there is the Housing Finance Agency, which Darren mentioned. This provides loans to local authorities and AHBs for housing by raising funds on the domestic and international capital markets. And then we have the LGMA, which supports the 31 local authorities. In terms of regulation and insurance, we have three bodies that I've put here. Well, ABRA, which is the Approved Housing Bodies Regulatory Authority, which regulates approved housing bodies. the RTB, which is the Residential Tenancies Board, and I'll come back to that in a little while, and the Irish Council for Social Housing, which we heard earlier from Donal McManus, which is supporting approved housing bodies across the country. So all of these work together to deliver more homes, to support strong communities and ensure a fair and well-regulated sustainable housing system in Ireland. So now moving on to some facts. Well, firstly, in Ireland, we have an increasing population. We've got demographic change is a central driver of housing demand. So in the last 50 years, the population has increased by over 70%. We've moved from being a country of emigration to immigration. In 2025, we are now almost 5.5 million people, and we project it to grow to more than 7 million people in the next 25 years. At the same time as our population is growing, our average household size is shrinking, and that's putting an increased demand on our housing stock. And like many other countries in Europe, our population, we have an older population, people are living longer, and that is also changing the type of housing required and increasing the need for smaller, accessible, universally designed homes. So where do we live in Ireland? So I think this is useful just to give you a snapshot of our housing tenure. So every 4 years, the Central Statistics Office, the CSO, good source of information on housing in Ireland, carries out a national census of households. The last census was in 2022, which recorded 1.84 million households across all tenure types. We're still predominantly a nation of homeowners, with 65.5% of households in homes either owned outright or with a mortgage, slightly below the European average of 68.5%. As a proportion of overall tenure, we have seen home ownership declining. The private rental sector, in the meantime, has been growing. Between 2016 and 2022, it grew by 7% to 18% of households. Just over, and I need to check that figure, so just over 1 in 10 households in Ireland live in social housing, and since 2021 that also includes now affordable housing, which was reintroduced. Of the social and affordable housing, local authorities provide approximately 70%, and approved housing bodies 30%, and the Land Development Agency is now also providing social and affordable housing. So the AHB sector, just to say, has assumed an increasingly important role, and you'll see that in the housing plan, which Dermot mentioned, in delivering and managing social and affordable housing, and provides, I suppose, a lot of the specialist accommodation for people in Ireland, for older people, people with disabilities, and households needing additional support. So do we like where we live? So yes, is the answer. Since 2018, the Housing Agency has been tracking levels of satisfaction with our housing and our neighbourhoods, and we carry out regular national representative surveys, which you can find the reports up on our website. So on the whole, we're satisfied. But there is a clear tenure divide. Owners are twice as likely to be satisfied or very satisfied with where they live compared to renters. While satisfaction with homes did fall slightly between 2018 and the last time this was published from 2023, we have found that neighbourhood satisfaction is slightly increased. And we will be, and is very high at 92%. We saw an increase in this over COVID as well. And so an updated study is expected to be published later this year if you're interested in delving into that in more detail. So this slide looks at what we're delivering, and it looks at last year's housing completions. So last year we built in Ireland a total of 36,284 new homes. A third of these were apartments and just over half were houses in group or housing schemes, that's the scheme dwellings. And then we had 16% were single dwellings or one-off housing. Of the homes being built, we had 9,089 of the total being built as social homes and affordable homes. And we had cost rental delivery last year stood at 2,347. So approved housing bodies delivered approximately 46% of all the social and affordable housing last year. The other note there is part 5, and what is part 5? And I think the name is moving to part 7. It's a provision that allows local authorities in Ireland to require developers to set aside a proportion of up to 20% of new residential developments for social or affordable housing, so which they can then buy at existing use value rather than full market value. In terms of the rental sector, as seen on the earlier slide, it has been increasing, both private and social and affordable rental. It has expanded. And this figure here, it's increased from 8% in 1991 to 20% by 2020. The RTB, which I mentioned earlier, regulates the sector and has 246,000 registered tenancies. And it's, so I suppose just to say the RTB, it's a professional national body. It registers tenancies, it provides dispute resolution services, and provides evidence on rents that are at the moment being paid across the country, and contributes, I suppose, to a more formalised and evidence-based regulatory framework. And I'll come back to that again when I look at some of the policy initiatives happening. In terms of challenges then, I suppose there are many influencing factors on housing policy. This is a summary slide which was put together by a colleague of mine, and just to say, I suppose, it's influenced by economic, demographic and institutional factors. We have seen, as across Europe, rising construction and development costs, and that's led to challenges with project viability and affordability of homes. We've seen, again, issues around availability of service land, infrastructure, having enough skilled labour, and development finance. Again, both Donal and Diarmuid spoke about this in their presentations. We also have strong employment here in Ireland and economic growth, and again that places increasing demand on our housing system. We have an ageing population, we have smaller households, and we also have a figure that was on an earlier slide. We have a very high number of younger adults still remaining living in their homes with their parents. So the current National Housing Plan, which Diarmuid put up earlier and spoke about, targets, as he said, 300,000 homes to be built between 2025 and 2030 across all tenures. Now, a key challenge in housing in Ireland over the last few years has been ramping up housing supply. So following our global, the global financial crisis, really our housing kind of building system collapsed, other than kind of one-off houses. And we can see even in 2012, we were just building 5,000 homes a year. So output has been recovering, as you can see here, moving steadily upwards up to 36,000, just over 36,000 homes completed last year. But we will have to ramp that up if we want to meet the target for 2030. In terms of another kind of figure that I think is useful to look at is what is the demand for social housing. And each year the Housing Agency compiles the summary of social housing assessments, which analyse the number of eligible households on the waiting lists of local authorities for social housing. So we have more than, as of last year, 61,719 households on this waiting list across the country. And of that 61,000, 6 in 10 are single adult households. So this is the most, and the most common living arrangement for people who are on the waiting list are that they're still living at home with either parents or living with relatives or friends. Again, homelessness, that was mentioned, and it is a focus of both the European Presidency when it's in Ireland, and also our current housing action plan. I'll just put up the figures here to show the level of homelessness in Ireland. The Department of Housing publishes official homelessness statistics every month, tracking all the time how many people, how many children are living in emergency accommodation. So you can find that on their website, and the numbers have been increasing. In May 2026, there were almost 17 and 500 adults and children living in emergency accommodation across Ireland. In terms of housing affordability, it is one of the most significant challenges within the Irish housing system. Just looking at this chart just compares the ratio of median house prices to median annual earnings in Dublin and selected European cities. And in 2024, we saw the price of a new home in Dublin was almost €500,000, or in 2026, sorry, €480,000. And you would need at least 9.6 times median annual earnings to be able to afford to buy a home in Dublin. In terms of rents, the standardised average rent in a new tenancy at the end of last year across Ireland was €1,755 per month, and that increases to €2,232 in Dublin. So there's a wealth of information which you can delve into on rents on the RTB website. So moving on to some policy initiatives. As Diarmuid spoke about, delivering homes, building communities sets out the government's housing action plan. It was published towards the end of last year, and its central objectives are to accelerate housing delivery and strengthen the national response to homelessness. So it does set out, I suppose, within the government's plan that housing is a really strong priority for the government, being able to provide secure housing, being essential to reducing inequality, support social cohesion, and enable balanced economic growth. In terms of actions, so as Diarmuid mentioned, 300,000 new homes being targeted to be built by 2030, and there's €9 billion set aside for housing and infrastructure to help with delivering this. In terms of the pillars, again, as Diarmuid pointed out, there are two key pillars. One is activating housing supply, which includes measures related to land activation, infrastructure, investment, project viability, and construction sector capacity. In terms of the second pillar, it focuses on increasing social housing, supporting affordable housing and affordable home ownership, protecting renters, and providing appropriate housing for older people. And there's a strong emphasis again on homelessness prevention, social inclusion, and also investing in our villages, towns, and cities. So it's worth taking a look at cost rentals. So there are many policy initiatives, and I've just picked out a few that are from this plan or our previous plan. Cost rental is a relatively new tenure for the Irish housing system. It was only introduced in Ireland in 2021. And again, the rents here now are linked to the cost of financing, constructing, managing and maintaining the homes rather than prevailing market rents, though linked to market rents. Cost rental housing tenure is intended for households that don't qualify for social housing, but do still face those affordability pressures in the rental sector, or they're not able to afford to buy a home, sometimes called the squeeze middle. So cost rental homes are principally delivered and managed by approved housing bodies, by the Land Development Agency, local authorities. Vacancy schemes. So again, there's a lot of interest in vacancy and tackling vacancy to kind of increase supply and increase sustainability. So it's an important element of the supply response by the Irish government. At the last census, we had 164,000 vacant homes counted, which doesn't include holiday homes. So the government is providing a range of supports which are aimed at tackling vacancy and bringing the homes back into use. So I have a selection of them here. The first is the Vacant Property Refurbishment Grant, which provides up to €50,000 for a qualifying vacant property to an owner to return it to use. And there's an additional top up where the property has been derelict and on the derelict register. The vacant above the shop grant is supporting conversion of vacant upper floors of commercial buildings back into homes. So again, that has been around towns, villages and our cities. You'll see a lot of vacancy above the shops, and this grant is particularly aimed at that. The repair and leasing scheme, this is where the owner kind of leases their property the owner retains the property, but a local authority or an AHB repairs and then leases it out for social housing for a set amount of time. And then the buy and renew scheme, under this scheme, the AHB or the local authority purchases the property and refurbishes it, the vacant property, and brings it back into permanent social housing stock. Croí Cónaithe Cities scheme. So Croí Cónaithe, I think this is means living heart in Irish, and it's about creating high density compact living. And what we found is that building apartments, it's really, I suppose, important now as our population and our demographics and our family size has changed, and there's a requirement to build close to transport, close to services in central areas. But building apartments can be more expensive than scheme houses, and there's a viability gap. That means that building the house or building the apartments can exceed the price that they can be sold at. So the Croí Cónaithe scheme, which is administered by the housing agency, was established to make sure that apartments are being built for sale to owner occupiers, not just for rental in urban areas. And it provides, I suppose, this targeted funding to help close that viability gap. So I mentioned that the rental sector, again, has been, the proportion of our population living in the rental sector has been increasing. And there's been a series of rental reforms that have been brought in to enhance the security of the tenure and to stability in this sector. So in March this year, new reforms were introduced with rent increases capped at 2%, or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower nationally. And there was an abolition of no-fault evictions and an introduction of 6-year tenancies to help provide greater certainty in the sector, both for landlords and for tenants. So the last initiative I'm going to talk about is Housing First. The Housing First, it's a national programme. It's being coordinated at a national level within the housing agency. And as many know, its core principle is that people experiencing long-term homelessness often have complex needs, and that these people should also be supported by being provided with permanent housing, stable housing, without first being required to progress through temporary or transitional accommodation. So once housed, participants receive flexible health, social supports tailored to their circumstances. So these wraparound supports come into play. And there's a very high level of, I suppose, tenancy sustainment with the Housing First programme. We have a success rate of over 85%. Currently, there are more than 1,000 people living as Housing First tenants in Ireland, and there's a target of an additional 2,000 more tenancies in Housing First by 2030. So I'm going to finish here with that whistle-stop tour. I have listed some websites here that I think might be useful, where you'll find lots more information in more detail on the housing system, research, statistics in Ireland. You'll also see a link on the right to a housing agency podcast called Housing Insights. You'll find episodes here on some of the topics that I've talked about, including Housing First, the new rental regulations that were introduced, the apartment living, and a lot more detail about Croí Cónaithe. So if you'd like to follow us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, please do. So thanks very much for listening.
Perfect. And actually to shamelessly plug again the Housing Europe Research Observatory, just to mention that my colleagues and I were currently actually working on a report commissioned by your colleagues in the LDA in Ireland, and that report will be looking at, let's say, emerging cost rental systems. So that's the cases of Catalonia in Spain, Poland and Czechia, and also actually a review of the rollout of cost rental in Ireland. with a view to seeing how our systems where cost rental is relatively new compared to the example Rosalind gave, where they've been doing cost rental for 100 years plus in Austria. How are they dealing with these kind of challenges around higher cost construction, viability gaps, the issue of moving towards a revolving fund model, and so on. So that report will hopefully be published, let's say, in the second half of this year. We don't have an exact date, but the research is already well advanced, so it could be a timely report, let's say, given that we know that there are some issues potentially in parts of the country around delivery of cost rental that could be looked at. Okay, so we were right upon the time that was allowed. As I said, I try to keep these things on time if at all possible. So I would just like to close by saying to thank you again to our speakers, to Diarmuid, Rosalind, and to Donal, who had to leave us earlier. Thank you again to all of the people who attended. We had over 100 people attend today's event, which, given relatively short notice, I know my colleagues in the communications department were a bit stressed about whether anyone would turn up, but in the end we had over 100 people, which is fantastic turnout. And to say to people that today's event has been recorded, it will be made available in a couple of days' time on the Housing Europe YouTube channel. And also these slides, we have agreement. So the slides of both Diarmuid and Rosalind will also be shared through the Housing Europe website. So Gurv Mila Ma Gwiv, thank you again very much for your attendance and for your attention to today's event. Thank you again to our speakers, and Slán August Bannacht.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.